Ben Riley-Smith, hello. Welcome to PoliticsJOE. How are you?
Hello, I'm very good. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. For those unfamiliar with your work, how would you introduce yourself? Tell us who you are.
I'm the politics editor at the Daily Telegraph, so working with the daily paper online, covering all the madness of Westminster as you guys are. Obviously done a lot of Tory upheaval over the last few years. So kind of in the trenches covering the Tory battles.
In amongst it. And obviously the reason we're talking, because of your book, Blue Murder, The Rise and Fall of the Conservative Government, 2010 to 2024. It's quite impressive, actually, I guess, in terms of the size of it. There's been quite a lot of rising and falling in the Conservative government over the last 14 years. Tell us about the book, and actually probably tell us about the process of trying to condense it down into something that was, I guess, about 300 pages long.
Yeah, so there have been some brilliant books about parts of the story, very in depth by various lobby colleagues and others. I wanted to take a wider approach about this whole chunk of time. We now know it's 14 years. Because actually, when you look at the whole of it, it's a remarkable run. There's only been one longer run from a single party in the last 100 years. That was the Maggie Major years. And they've had this unbelievable turnaround, 5 PMs back to back. And yet, despite all that change and shape-shifting, somehow the party has managed to remain in power for so long. And I approached the book by trying to say, OK, why don't we zoom in on 10 moments of change to understand how they happened, how this party that kind of ruthlessly pursues power so effectively managed to change what it was about. I mean, think for a moment, it went from being a government determined to defeat Brexit, that was what David Cameron's government was ultimately doing with the referendum, to a government determined to deliver Brexit with not a single change in power. Who would have thought on that referendum night, 8 years later, they would have been in power? And then I've updated it for this paperback version with an extra chapter all about the general election. So why Rishi Sunak decided to go early, how they mucked up D-Day, the idea that they were sounding out reform for a potential deal, and ultimately ending the story.
We're going to get into all of that and no doubt more over the course of the conversation. Let's start quickly, though, with some of the most recent news, today's news, the week's news, I guess. We've had a big speech from Starmer, and we've also had a big story on the front page of The Sun today about banning smoking in beer gardens and outside sports stadiums. I'd be interested to hear your take on Starmer as a political figure and his ideas, because one vein of thought, which is one I'm possibly subscribed to, which sees him as DPP through to where we are now, and actually in his response to the riots as well, possibly quite an authoritarian figure, someone who's very quick in terms of the administration of justice, the severity of justice, and in terms of banning things like smoking outside of sports events or in beer gardens, strikes me as sort of quite a serious possible breach of people's individual freedoms and liberties. So in the context of those various things that I've just named out loud to you, how do you interpret them in relation to kind of the politics of Keir Starmer?
Well, I think it's fascinating because when you're in opposition, you kind of construct certain positions that don't necessarily have a vast amount of depth because you never need to go through the process in government of delivery and exactly how you're going to word that law or that rule. So I think the truth is we don't have a brilliant sense of Keir Starmer's personal politics. Also, it shifted around in those years. You know, he ran on a pretty leftist agenda, kind of aping a lot of Jeremy Corbyn's positions, ultimately tacked to the centre after that Hartlepool by-election and a reshuffle that brought some more moderate centrist candidates in. So I think one reason why the smoking thing is interesting is you're beginning to see the iterations below a kind of single one-sentence position in the campaign. So we knew he said, I'm going to keep Rishi Sunak's smoking ban. You're now seeing every kind of iteration of that. It's like double-clicking on that folder and saying, OK, what does that actually mean? Well, hang on, what does that mean? Are you still comfortable with people smoking outside venues? If you're not, OK, which type of venues? I mean, even in The Sun's reporting, they said there's a debate about public parks. Is smoking allowed there? How close do you get to people? How close will you be allowed to smoke near the outside of a pub? Is it 100 metres or 10 metres? So government forces you to think with real clarity about where you are in all these positions. And I'm not sure he knows, or we certainly don't know, exactly where his kind of big picture ideological positioning is.
On the substance of the point, I can kind of, it actually seems more logical to me than the previous sort of legislation that exists around drug taking, drug use, because I think on the one hand, if you look at things, illegal substances or things that we currently deem as illegal in terms of their damage to our health, quite often it's less dangerous than smoking. Like, smoking kills you. We know that it kills you, right? It's incredibly bad for you. And in a way, it's the kind of the Peter Hitchens-esque argument, which is that not only should those things remain illegal, but actually we should seriously talk about tobacco, we should seriously talk about alcohol. So at least in that sense, I guess, it is consistent, because we're talking about harm reduction, this sort of thing's more dangerous, so we're going to ban it. Yeah. Something you said there that really interested me, Starmer was leader of the opposition for the better part of 5 years. He's now the Prime Minister. It's quite interesting to say that we don't necessarily have much of a grip on what his personal politics are, because that's actually quite a lot of time in sort of frontline politics, national politics. And yet I'd be inclined to agree with you. What his sort of, beyond pragmatism, maybe, and can that be a defining political ideology?
Yeah.
I don't think I could adequately answer the question either.
Well, I suppose one of the reasons, if you step back even further, is yes, he was opposition leader for almost 5 years, but he only came to Parliament in 2015, in his early 50s. So he has not had that much direct involvement in politics day to day for decades. If you think of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, they were MPs for ages and then living and breathing it before then. Cameron and Osborne were advisors, and then they became backbench MPs and then rose up the system. So they had 10, 20 years to think about Westminster and how to manoeuvre within it, and also where is their own personal thinking on all these policy issues. If you're working off in the law, possibly week in, week out, you're not thinking about what exact balance do you strike between liberty and freedom when it comes to somebody's right to smoke or have smoke waft over them and how it impacts their health. And maybe it speaks to something about his he doesn't feel to me someone who is deeply ideological. In fact, I remember I interviewed him for a profile piece this year, and both he and his team turned that into a strength. And they say, yeah, he doesn't look at this from a soft left or a left wing or a Blairite agenda. He's someone who looks at it, sees a problem, says, how do I get to the solution? So they say, look, on railways, he ultimately decided, yes, there was an argument for nationalisation, and that's one of the first bills they're bringing to Parliament, and they're leaning in on that. But then talking about wealth creation being part of his major priority along with economic growth, that's not something a left-wing Labour figure would usually talk about. So I don't think he has this huge overarching ideology that everything slots into.
You spent a fair bit of time with him for that profile piece.
Yeah, it was fantastic, actually. We got to talk to him before and after the locals, and afterwards it was in this kind of local Kentish Town cafe, trying to get a sense of his grounding and also lots of his inner circle. I mean, one of the other things that emerged, I think actually you've seen in the early weeks of government, is he is a politician who is probably more ruthless than we tend to give him credit for in terms of political ruthlessness. When he was leader, nobody else had effectively shunted out their previous leader within months, or certainly within a year. The way in which some allies were discarded in some of the reshuffles. And then if you look in the first 2 months, Emily Thornberry had been his Shadow Attorney General for a long time and then didn't get the call up and was dumped. Some of the shadow number 10 figures in opposition hadn't come over with them in number 10. So I think there is a political ruthlessness to him that perhaps we'll see more of in power.
No, I totally agree on that point. And I think often in recent years we've lost sight of actually the relative gamble that it was to take that position on Corbyn. Because if you inherit that party, and particularly the mass membership and the way that a lot of that membership felt about Jeremy Corbyn, it was not a straight decision to deal with him in the way that he did. It was actually a bit of a gamble, but they went for it and they pursued it ruthlessly, as you say. And I think that also informs his thinking on things like, for example, so let's take the general election campaign, and I didn't really hear very much, Ben, I'm sure you didn't either, about cutting winter fuel payment during the general election campaign. No. I didn't hear very much. Well, I did hear quite a lot about taxes, but it was a relentless affirmation that we will not raise taxes on working people.
Yeah.
It certainly seems like that's going to be what comes in Rachel Reeves' budget. And I think he's actually, even though, like you said, very recently come into politics, I actually think he's quite a canny and, again, ruthless political operator.
Oh, yeah, I mean, the result speaks to that. They fantastically, on taxes, brilliant. The Tories gave them a massive opening because of the tax rises and also Truss's mini-budget exploding and the economy. Suddenly the Tories weren't trusted on the economy in the same way. Labour governments, the concern when they're in opposition is always, are they going to spend all their money? They're going to hike taxes? Can they really control the economy? And they shut down that debate with ruthless efficiency in the election. You saw how the Tories tried every day to weaponise tax. They began by pointing out every single tax rise you could do and saying, are you going to rule this out? Are you going to rule that out? But it didn't really quite grip, partly because of the Tory legacy of tax rises, but also because Starmer and Reeves projected this message that we are not the type of party that wants to come in and raise tax. But again, you see the ruthlessness, because we are now, and the speech we had this week saying, look, it's going to be a painful budget, they are now setting expectations high that there is going to be a lot of pain coming.
Obviously, we don't have the substance of it yet, and part of what we're doing right now is kind of reading the tea leaves about what's going to come in that budget. The language, though, deployed, which is one of kind of, it's going to be painful, it's not going to be easy, it's going to get worse before it gets better, the sort of anti-DREAM rhetoric, and we can look at Reeves in the Commons just before they went on recess as well. Yeah. And some commentary, it's a point I've made actually, is that an interpretation of this could be either a continuation of austerity or at least economic thinking that still is in the same kind of cinematic universe, shall we say, as George Osborne and David Cameron.
Yeah, Osborne made that point himself as well.
Yeah.
He said it was kind of copying Osborne.
Is it over-egging it to suggest that, do you think? At the end of the day, we're still looking at pretty big public sector pay rises. We're looking at a pretty aggressive, apparently, house building programme. How do you think we should interpret what is to come? And I appreciate I'm asking you a hypothetical about something we don't know the substance of yet.
Well, I think the first thing to say is when you look at Osborne and austerity, they did shrink the size of the state. So if you looked at public spending as a percentage of GDP, it decreased. Even with this tight spending plan that they've inherited by the Tories, it's still just growing as 1% real terms increase in public spending, and Labour wants to go further than that. So I think they are determined to say this isn't austerity 2.0. But then you've got a couple of realities. One is the public finances are incredibly tight, and I think there is some truth, though possibly not total truth, in this Labour idea that they are surprised by some of the spending, especially on the soaring asylum hotels bill that they didn't know about before the election.
Yep.
So they feel they need to raise money in this budget. This is not a giveaway budget. There's also some wider political things that, look, you're in for 5 years. If you want to take tough decisions, take them early, because are people in 2029 really going to be voting on the 2024 budget? So if you need to do some hard choices to raise money quickly, like abandoning universal winter fuel payments, do them early. But I think on the big picture of what Starmer and Reeves, also I think they're trying to do this three-part narrative that is the same approach that he did with his leadership, which was, kind of sort the internals out and push out the left, basically prosecute the Tories on the argument and then build your argument for why it should be Labour. They're already beginning to set out this 3 steps for this 5 years. So if you saw on Starmer's speech on the podium, it said fixing the foundations. So I think it's kind of prosecuting the argument that the Tories left it terribly and we need to do tough things. And then it will be about delivering and pushing through some of the reforms, and then the kind of fruits and benefits of that in growth or extra spending or giveaways in the latter half of the Parliament. So I think you're beginning to see that come up. It is going to be hard on tax rises. They were so repeatedly reassuring to the public that huge tax rises weren't coming, that if there are sizable tax rises, it's going to be tricky. One last thing, I do wonder if there's a lot of expectation management coming. So Reeves and now Starmer coming out and saying, I think it's compared to like a punch. Like if you're punched out of blue in your face, you're kind of reeling on the floor, shocked. If someone says, I'm going to punch you, it's going to be really painful, and then you brace and it hits you and you're like, oh, it wasn't actually as bad as I thought. So I think they're going to build up the idea that the budget is going to be woeful for everybody, and then hope they come in a bit under expectation.
Yeah, and that point you made, right, about limiting their capacity, because you're not going to pull the big taxation levers. What are you left with? Inheritance tax, fuel duty, possibly like you could revisit council tax in some capacity or in some way. But
capital gains.
Yeah.
Keeps floating about.
Duncan Robinson wrote a really good piece in The Economist a while ago where he was talking about how should you raise taxes? Like, what's the best way of doing it? And that I'm paraphrasing him, and I won't obviously do as good a job of it as he did, but essentially, like, previous tax ideas and policy is always you try and pluck the goose without it going completely mental and hissing at you relentlessly. Like, that's the balancing act. But actually, but I think it's Ken Clarke who makes the point. In a year's time, no one remembers the budget. Actually, possibly a better idea is to, like, kick the piss out of the goose in your first year. By the time you're getting to the next election, it's gone. But, it's back of people's minds. Oh, fuel duty went up 10 pence. Forget about it now. Yeah. And I wonder how much, which way they'll go with it. But you mentioned the speech, and we've spoken about it in a fair amount of detail there. One of the other things he mentioned was about the recent rioting, and he attributed it in a way. The quote is 14 years of failure and populism that let rot grow in the heart of our system. Do you think that's a fair analysis? Do you think, having spent time thinking about the last 14 years, whether or not you can trace it in that direct a fashion to the unrest that we saw in the summer?
Well, I think not entirely. What he was clearly trying to do with that speech was hammer home this idea that the Tory inheritance was terrible and therefore they've got to do tricky things. And it's all copying this 2010 playbook when the Tories came in and said, look, Labour, crash the car, crash the economy, don't give them the keys back. Even though was Gordon Brown really responsible for the global financial crash? Probably not. So they're doing that same playbook. And what was slightly strange about the speech is if we talked a month ago and you said Starmer's going to do an end of summer big speech to the country, you would have thought, oh, right, about the riots, what went on, this difference between criminality and the causes behind it and how he saw it as a whole and fixing it. Actually, the riots were kind of used as a block to slot into this wider argument about, oh, it's also terrible with the Tories. I thought, I mean, clearly he's right when he says the prison places, there are very few of them. You can have debate about austerity and how that's linked to the frustrations that emerged. I did think it was stretching credibility slightly to say rioters were getting out on the streets because they thought, oh, there were only a couple of hundred prison places, so we can do it and get away with it. I mean, I'm not sure that was the driving motivation behind all these people. But look, there is this obvious debate about austerity. In my mind, I don't think I understand well enough what drove that kind of explosion of violence over 10 days. Was it linked in the short term to the election and how some of these issues were at the forefront of people's minds? Yeah. I don't know.
The thing that concerns me, I think, is looking at turnout in the election. I think that's the most important thing that connects to the rioting. And I think IPPR had it at about 52%. I've seen other figures that put it close to 60. Regardless, it's still a historic low. Right, and I think an interpretation of that is that it's a general election of apathy, and a key part of the way that Labour was able to win in the way it did was huge parts of the Tory vote just not coming out. Right, people staying at home. I know plenty of people that said, "Look, I'm a Tory. I'll never vote for Labour, but I can't vote for this lot. I'm just not going to bother this time round." I'm sure you will have spoken to many people like that as well.
34% is low. What they got?
Yeah,
34%.
Absolutely. And it kind of touches on this sort of like anti-politics, call it what you want, that essentially if you don't, a political party of any stripe, if you don't tell a story about people's lives, if you don't help them make sense of the world, and crucially actually, if you don't make the world better, then people sort of end up being driven towards the politics of hatred, the politics of distrust, potentially of conspiracy, and turning out in their hundreds and their thousands and throwing bricks at mosques. That's how I kind of see the two connecting to each other.
I think number 10 gets a lot of that as well. I mean, as you said, the reverse de-ream. I mean, that was deliberate in the run-up to the election. A lot of them were saying, look, it's not 97. Yeah. There is not this surge of joy and excitement and enthusiasm. People are beaten down and tired and frustrated and totally disbelieving that politics can change anything positively about their lives. So I think his rhetoric about it's going to get worse before it gets better speaks to that. So I do think they understand that public sentiment, whether they've got the policy answers to ease some of that.
And on the other side of the sort of main national political divide and the area in which this book specialises, the Conservative Party, we were talking just before we started recording about the timing of the leadership contest and whether they're getting it right, how Starmer's being able to kind of say what he likes virtually unopposed. So let's start. Just talk to me a little bit about how you see the Tory leadership connecting to this, the absence of Rishi Sunak, perhaps. How do you see all these things coming together?
Yeah, so the runners and rulers of the Tory party have decided it is best to go long with their leadership race to succeed Sunak rather than short. So he lost the election in July. The winner is ultimately not going to be picked until November. There were some people arguing, look, we should rush it forward and have someone by September, possibly do the MP's bit that knocks it down to 2 by the end of July. I think their thinking is, in the longer term, it is better to have a real reflective point where the party can step back after a decade and a half in government and think, okay, what do we believe in? Where do we stand? What type of leader do we want to lead us into the 2020s and ideally into government into the 2030s? And if you don't have somebody by autumn after the election, that's not really a big deal, because the most important thing is we have a big debating point, and we see of these candidates, some of them, 6 of them, many aren't that well known, who thrives, who has the deepest thinking, who has the prescription for where the party should go now. I think that's the reason why they went for it. A weakness, and I talked to Tory MPs who voiced this at the time when they were debating about the timings, is you effectively lead the playing field open for Labour to stamp their narrative on what is happening over the next couple of months. So over the summer, Rishi Sunak was on holiday, a lot of other frontbenchers were on holiday. During the riots, there was very little commentary from the shadow cabinet, certainly not the acting Tory leader, about what was happening. So you're in this slightly liminal space where one of these 6 leadership candidates, they're kind of all slightly responding to events, but there's no singular Tory attack. And one other problem, I was talking to someone involved in the defence world, and they were saying about the issue of whether Storm Shadow should be used by Ukraine in Russia, which are these UK missiles that we need to give them permission to use. They can't take a position on that, the Tories. They can't pile pressure on Starmer, because Rishi Sunak is basically sticking to all his pre-election policy positions, and everybody is waiting to see who the new leader is, who will then sign off new policy positions. But for months and months, we're going to be in this weird liminal space where the Tories aren't really prosecuting Labour.
Yes, and I guess the flip side benefit possibly is that if you're about to spend the better part of 5 years being the leader of the opposition, why not have 4 months off at the beginning before you get into the relentless slog of and actually a novel experience for many of these people, the difficulty in just securing some media attention, getting a policy position out there in the way that I think recent Labour leaders are all too familiar with, that actually it's very different being the leader of the opposition as opposed to a serving cabinet member, whoever. It's a different game, isn't it?
You realise all you got is words. All you have is words. You can position yourself with some policy, you can try and write an op-ed with a newspaper, you can get on TV, but fundamentally you're just pouring out words and positions and attack lines. You don't have the kind of levers on power in any way. I think they're still readjusting to that. So when you send out a quote as a shadow whatever minister, doesn't mean it's inherently newsworthy. It's just kind of words that may or may not get taken into a news story.
What's the view of your readership? I mean, political editor at the Telegraph, I wager compared to most journalists, you've got a pretty good idea of how the contest is shaping up. What are your readers saying when they're writing into you? How do you see, of the 6 we've got so far, give us like a rough overview of the contest so far and who's popular, shall we say, with your readership?
I think the truth is it's very early to say, because I think a lot of the country, as well as a lot of Westminster, slightly switched off in August and said we've had a lot of politics this year. We've just had 6 weeks pure run of the election. So they're beginning to tune back in, and September and October things will really ramp up. I think there's this interesting divide between the next generation Tories and the slightly older leadership candidates. So you have some bigger established figures, like James Cleverly, who was Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary, Priti Patel, who was Home Secretary and held a whole load of other ministerial jobs. The challenge for them is to convince people that they have the future answers rather than just being a central part of the past government. So, Priti Patel has to explain why she has the vision to take them all the way through the 2020s and then the policy prescriptions for the 2030s. I think that is going to be more of a challenge than some of these fresher faces, Kemi Badenoch, Tom Tugendhat, and Robert Jenrick, who did hold ministerial posts, but none of them held great offices of state. And they're all younger, and they do have the feel of the kind of next generation of Tories coming through who now might have the chance to take up more senior positions. And then you've got Mel Stride as the 6th candidate, who is probably the least well-known of those 6. He's kind of, critics have called him continuity Rishi, but I think he's arguing for a moderate, centrist, serious policy position. And it remains to be seen who's going to get through next week. So we have the first round of voting on Wednesday. MPs knock it down from 6 to 5. Then the week after, they knock it down 5 to 4. And that's the real heart of the campaign, as those 4 then go on to party conference. And party conference is a showboating chance for them to lay out their stand, try to do the Cameron moment, the no-note speech, and excite the base. And then ultimately, Tory MPs knock it down to 2, and then the grassroots pick the winner in November.
I'm hesitant to talk about leadership election rules, but I do think it's important, right?
Yeah.
Starmer's actually considering doing, I think possibly is, / considering trying to get it through his conference, changing the way that Labour selects its leader, brackets, to stop a Jeremy Corbyn type figure coming back. But let's talk about it anyway.
Yeah.
Because is there or is there not, to your mind, a gap between the stated preferences and will of the Tory party membership and the stated preferences and will of the parliamentary party and, I guess more broadly, the electorate at large? Because
Yes, definitely. Undeniably there is. Yeah.
yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
Because if you think about, I don't know, Liz Truss. Okay, if we use Liz Truss as an example, the Tory membership chooses her over Sunak. Sunak spends the whole election campaign like belligerently saying, "I know you don't want to hear this, but if we do what she says she wants to do, it's going to be bad." Lo and behold, that's what transpires. She loses in the general election. The first time she comes into the wider electorate, they kick her out. And whether or not there has to be some kind of consideration, either from the parliamentary party, from CCHQ, whatever it is, that perhaps the current mechanism whereby the membership decides on the final two might not be the soundest strategy for getting back to winning ways. I say that, and again, the book deals with it. It's a relentless election winning machine. So maybe they actually do know what they're doing, and I'm just, posturing. But nonetheless.
Well, I think that it's a fascinating question, and that's actually really at the heart of the book. So to understand how the party can be so ruthless in its pursuit of power and so flexible and able to shift is this trigger system it has. So just to remind people of the boring details, everybody knows about the 1922 no confidence letters. You need 15% of Tory MPs to submit one of these letters to trigger a thumbs up, thumbs down vote. So that's not many. That's 1 in 8.
Particularly now.
Yeah. I can't even do the maths. It's probably about 18 people, something like that.
18 letters.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's tiny. And in the book, actually, I quote David Cameron saying, in his 11 years, not for a moment did he not have that figure in his head, because he knew if you did a misstep, there's this trigger system and they'll come for you. Compare that to Labour, it's 20%. And there's no confidence mechanism. That has to be people backing a single other candidate, and then you have to do so publicly. The Tories could do so privately. So clearly they can change leader very, very, very quickly. That can work brilliantly at times, explaining that how they moved from anti-Brexit to pro-Brexit while remaining in power. They realised May wasn't getting her deal through. They needed someone who could see off Farage and the Brexit Party surge, win an election and a majority, and therefore get the Brexit deal through the Commons. And they looked around and saw Boris Johnson was the best placed person to do those three things. Got him into power, he did all those three things, they won another 5 years. And then for a whole load of reasons, things began to spiral, possibly because they were focusing on those three things rather than someone who has this wider vision for the country. But when it goes wrong, and it began to go wrong, because once you go for regicide once, it becomes easier to go for it again. They thought, well, okay, midway through Boris Johnson's tenure, it's not really working. How about we switch? Got rid of him, and then ultimately, because it's the members who pick the final two, the MPs whittle it down, they went for Truss over Sunak, and events would suggest possibly what happened wouldn't have happened if Sunak had been in charge. So the ability to get rid of leaders helped them keep power, but sped up their departure from power ultimately. I guess your question is whether members should still get the vote on the final two. I know a lot of MPs, actually at the end of this book, Lord Howard, Michael Howard, who led the party and was the one who paved the way for David Cameron to come in, he said, look, it might be unpopular, but I think members should get less of a say. Because ultimately, with that trigger system, the group that determines whether you stay or go as leader is the MPs. And supporters of a change would say the MPs really understand their colleagues better than others. Yeah. But it's very hard as a new leader in a newly defeated party to say, my proposal is to give all our members less power and we'll sort it out. It's a very tough argument, which is why Starmer does it at the end when he's most powerful. Yes,
and the interesting thing is actually a relatively recent advent, right, in our modern politics. I think 70s and 80s for Labour and the Tories, and Labour used to have the trade unions got a pretty big say in it, as much as they split into thirds, I think, between the Parliamentary Labour Party, the unions, and the membership.
Yeah. Well, it was Hague. Yeah. It was under Hague.
2001?
Yeah, somewhere between 97 and 2001 that they did that. And then Miliband was kind of aping those moves when he brought in the...
Because really, who is the Prime Minister? It's who can command the confidence of the House of Commons, right? So...
And the problem is if you have a leader who didn't come first with the MPs. So both Ian Duncan Smith and Liz Truss didn't come first with the MPs. I think I'm right with IDS with that.
Yeah.
But then came first with the members, and then immediately you come back to leading this group of MPs, and you know they're not behind you.
Can I ask you to make a prediction? Who do you think is going to be in the final two?
All my predictions are always wrong.
Political predictions are a terrible thing to get into.
Yeah.
Caveat.
The closest I'll go is I think the final two. I suspect the leader will be from one of the younger generation of Tories. Those three: Kemi Badenoch, Robert Jenrick, and Tom Tugendhat, rather than the other three. But that is just an instinct based on the early mood, and I wouldn't put any money against it. Not that I would, given what happened before the election with the Tories.
It's very early, but the interesting. Let's talk a bit more then, okay, about that next generation and where the Tory party is now, as opposed to 2010, the party of Osborne and Cameron. Where do you see the key differences being, particularly in the context of this reinvention, this ability to adapt, this ability to win? Where do you see there being similarities? Where do you see there being differences, both ideological, operational? Talk to me about how it's changed.
I think the truth right now is we don't know, and they're in total disarray. So the core bit of that is, who are these 121 Tory MPs?
Yep.
Even us who are paid to understand the contours of parliamentary parties, I think don't have a brilliant grip of it, because from July they were 360 odd and now they're 120. Are they more right-leaning than that group? Are they more left-leaning? And then I think the party, and this is why maybe it's good to go long on their leadership race, hasn't begun to work out what narrative it wants to sell to the country about itself and its values. So there is a deep well of frustration in the Conservative Party that they slightly lost their way and slightly weren't entirely clear about what they were trying to achieve. There were circumstantial reasons for that, but they did hike taxes up to their highest level in 70 years and spending likewise. And then, aren't they the small state party of Thatcher who is meant to row back the frontiers of the state a little bit? So I think there needs to be a period of deep thinking about what are the forces and policy issues that are going to define our lives in the next 5-10 years, and where do they see traditional Conservative values or tweak Conservative values applying to those, and then how does that lead to policy positions? So I think it needs a deep bit of work, and I'm not sure anybody has a clear kind of set answer yet.
That's the interesting thing for me. I've seen, what we call them, grandees, possibly. I guess you Damien Greens, Howard, others, talking and saying, essentially, we run the risk of learning the wrong lesson from this defeat, and that. There's a pretty strong strain of thought actually, which is suggesting, okay, we have this ginormous threat on our right flank. We need to see that off before we even talk about going back to the rest of the electorate. There are plenty of sort of former moderate centrist, the lot that got purged under Johnson, who are kind of saying, by God, no, we just need to return to being conservative. We need to get back to what our party is actually about. Doesn't necessarily mean one nationism, but small state, lowest taxes as possible, having some sort of respect and try and generate some trust in public institutions, the public realm, etc. What's your read on which way the party will tend to go? I know obviously it's entirely dependent on who the new leader is, but that tendency to kind of, how does the party diverge ideologically here?
Yeah.
I feel that is the important question.
Yeah, I think often when you move into opposition from a period in government, there's a tendency to be purist and to move towards wherever the centre of gravity of your party is. So the idea that, look, in government, we made all these compromises to who we really are, and now why don't we kind of free ourselves and be who we really are? So it's interesting with New Labour, you had Miliband who won holding New Labour at a distance to a degree, but then ultimately lost, and I think he felt he got caught between trying to be properly radical and trying to stick to the New Labour, kind of be centrist and take the edges off some of your policies to reassure. And then the grassroots said, well, screw it, if that didn't even work and we're still out of power, why don't we just really do what we believe in? And a real rejection of New Labour with Corbyn. And you just wonder whether the Tories, certainly in the last couple of years, when we look at our mailbag, there's been a lot of frustration about rising tax, rising spending, doing things that weren't possibly kind of traditional Tory values, and an appeal to go towards that. And you can see some of the candidates speaking to that. So we had a piece for a Tory MP backing Priti Patel yesterday, and her big pitch is like, I'll hear the grassroots and I'll return us to authentic conservative values. I think the truth is, it can be a bit hackneyed, and which values do you really believe in, and how do they, if you believe in free markets, how is that applied to the AI challenge of the next 10 years? And if you believe in people's kind of freedom to be safe, how is that applied to these online challenges? So I think it's all quite confused right now, but ultimately it will depend on the leader and who gets picked.
And you're and the point, as made in the book, right, of what does it mean to be authentically conservative when the party is so effective at adjusting its positions on things in the pursuit of power. The Brexit example is a good one. So what does it actually mean to be a member of the Conservative and Unionist Party, I think is the key question. And I think, most importantly, that extra chapter you added, right, talking about the election, whether or not, and it connects to what we were saying about tax and Starmer at the beginning, right? Every Tory spokesperson you heard from during the election would saying till the cows come home, they're going to put your taxes up, they're going to put your taxes up, they're going to put your taxes up. No one listened. No one cared. And as dramatically bad as D-Day was and other gaffes, my personal sort of belief is that actually I feel like the electorate had already made its mind up, and it was almost like a collective rolling of the eyes. And if it was a 1 or 2 point race and something like that happens, then it really is, oh my God, like what has he done? It's over. But if you look at the kind of 18 months before polling day, the sort of just sort of kind of, I would almost call it stagnant polling of the Tory party, where even, with pretty lumpy tax cuts coming in, barely a flicker, right, in the national polling, that it was almost like the electorate had just kind of made its mind up. Like, we've given you a chance. You've had 14 years. It could be, government mandated and funded holidays to Barbados for everyone in the autumn. They still wouldn't get voted. Maybe that's going a bridge too far.
No, I think that is pretty much it. If you look at the polling, the most critical moment was the Liz Truss mini budget that imploded and was seen to have pushed up interest rates and contributed to people's pain in mortgages. So I think there are two core, at the core of the Conservative Party and their appeal is the idea you can trust them with the economy. And there's always that question mark with Labour. And that, okay, you might not like them, but they can run things pretty credibly and efficiently. And both of those two things disappeared in that moment, and they dropped down to 20 plus points behind, and it never really changed with Rishi. It tightened a bit and then went back. And you're right, huge national insurance tax cuts didn't move it. A whole load of resets didn't move it. And actually, there is an argument that bits of the campaign were run quite effectively by the Tories in that 6 weeks. They did a blitz of policy announcements that dominated the front pages. In the debates, he was a better prosecutor of his argument and managed to shine a light on Starmer's weaknesses and got headlines on the back of it. So purely kind of the dynamics of that seemed to work. But the reason they did this pivot to talking about a supermajority, and in the chapter I quote the memo that was written explaining it halfway through, is people do not believe we are going to win. And so they do not see the point in voting Tory, even if they like some of these things. And so they counterintuitively have to lean into the idea they're going to win big, because then people suddenly think, okay, Labour are going to win, but I don't want them to have a super majority and have absolute power. I better maybe vote for my Tory candidate just to have some kind of opposition there.
You mentioned Liz Truss there. You interviewed her for the book. Tell me a little bit about that conversation, your time with her, and how she evaluates her time in office.
Yeah, so this was a while ago. I think it was about a year ago, and I did it for the hardback version. So I think she'd been out of office about 6 or 7 or 8 months. It basically saw a version of what you've now seen publicly, which is a belief that forces were against her when she was in office, be they the OBR or be they Rishi Sunak supporters who were willing to move more quickly and give her no time in office. And a kind of suspicion of the civil service that I think has kind of escalated since she's left office. And also there wasn't, so I also interviewed Kwasi Kwarteng for the book as well. He was pretty open about saying, look, if I could have my time again, I would have done some things differently. So with that mini budget, there wasn't spending restraint alongside because there was another fiscal moment that was going to do that. They didn't go to the OBR to check the numbers because they were going to do that later in the year. And maybe those were missteps that were wrong. There wasn't a lot of remorse from Truss, and I think you've seen that publicly. She believes she was right. She believes she gets the blame for what was happening, possibly with some degrees of truth, because interest rates were rising and inflation was rising separate from that mini budget. So kind of people's mortgage increases aren't purely her fault. But yeah, I think that politically it's tricky when clearly that moment, the biggest moment of your premiership, didn't go well. You had to reverse it, not to express any remorse for the pain that was caused, or an admittance that you may have got some errors wrong. I think we still haven't really seen that from her.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was talking to, I was on Newsnight yesterday. Was it yesterday? No, the day before. When you're awake so late, sort of like forget which day it was. And I was on with Simon Clarke, and I was talking to him about it, key Liz Truss ally. And he was like, yeah, obviously clearly got some things wrong. He was actually quite accusatory towards the Bank of England. And felt that, particularly in relation to like LDI, that they had kind of overstepped the mark a little bit in what they were doing there. And the other key thing, funny thing he told me, which was, I think it might be from the Selden book rather than sort of any like private insight. So caveat that. But it was essentially that I think Kwasi was going to go on Kunzberg and sort of basically try and calm the whole thing down and like sound sensible. And then like Liz calls him 10 minutes beforehand and is like, that like Limmy meme where it's like we're not backing down, we're doubling down, right? And then away we go. And I
he says on it, there's more to come, or we're only just starting. And that was this feeling that the market's already nervous. And he said, no, we got more tax cuts to come. Was the implication. So on Monday, that was when the sterling began to move.
Meltdown. Ben Riley-Smith, thank you so much for coming in. Blue Murder: Rise and Fall of the Conservative Government, paperback, available in all good booksellers and bad booksellers as well.
I've got no doubt. And on audiobook.
Do you read the audiobook?
I did, yes. Actually, quite good fun.
Yeah?
It's quite full on. You're in this little pod for like hours and hours and hours, and you just go, and every time you trip up, they rewind it a second, and you hear your voice, and you got to carry it on in. But yeah, it was great doing it.
Very, very glad you came in. Thank you for talking to us. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Cheers, Ben.